Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Central Library of the Boston Public Library. For those of you who don't know, I'm David McKay, the head of the Boston Public Library Foundation, and I welcome you to our third in our series, Common Ground. The video you just saw a few minutes ago was put together by Fran Kelly, a member of our board of directors, and his team at Arnold Worldwide. And the idea of the video was to give people an idea of how important this fabulous institution is to the people of Boston and the citizens of the Commonwealth. The work of the foundation is really to provide funding for programs for all ages, from children to seniors, for exhibitions and lectures such as the one tonight, capital improvements, acquisitions for the entire library system, all in the name of advancing learning, the library's mission. If you're interested in learning more about what the foundation does, I invite you to look us up on the web at bplf.com. Before I introduce Jeff Rudman, who will introduce the panel, it's my job to remind you that all those things that make sound, smartphones, iPads, beepers, and what have you, sound a lot louder when it's quiet. So if you would be so kind as to make sure they're off, that would be great. The library and the foundation are grateful to the Lowell Institute for their continued sponsorship of this series. When it was founded in 1836, the Lowell Institute began supporting speaker series in many different institutions, and its specific mission is to make great ideas accessible to all people free of charge, fitting perfectly with our motto, free to all. This year's Lowell Lecture Series, Common Ground, celebrates public spaces and their creators and communities of users. This series is part of a larger initiative here at the library, Building Boston. And it has, the lecture series are part of programs that we have throughout the city at Boston Public Library locations, and 5 impressive exhibitions here in the Central Library, and they include Palaces for the People, Guastavino and America's Great Public Spaces, The People's Own, the construction of the McKim Building, An Elevated View about the Orange Line, and Boston Sports Temples, which just opened on Saturday to the public, and Boston and the Gilded Age, Mapping Public Places in the Norman B. Leventhal Map Center. At our next lecture on December 5th, we will welcome Professor John Oxendorf, the scholar behind Palaces for the People exhibition. It's now my pleasure to introduce the chair of the Boston Public Library Board of Trustees, Jeff Rudman, who has been serving as the trustee of the library for the past 8 years and was elected chair in 2006. And he has been a fabulous partner of the Boston Public Library Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, may I please welcome Jeff Rudman.
Thank you, David. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. On behalf of the Board of Trustees of the BPL, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Lowell Lecture Series and to Building Boston. As you know, this library has many stakeholders, many constituencies, and many missions. But there is no mission more central to what we do, day in, day out, than serve the Republic of Letters and the community of scholars. And in that service, nothing is more honored than the service rendered by the Lowell Lectures. They have been with us since 1836, and they are going strong still. It may be parochial of me as a lawyer to harp on how special this occasion is, where we are visited by a justice of the Supreme Court and a judge of the United States District Court for the District of Massachusetts. Has this ever happened before in our past? I don't know. I don't want to pronounce on that. But it is, I think, a very, very special occasion, and very, very glad that under the auspices of the Lowell Lecture Series, it came to pass. What should make this occasion so edifying for all the Bostonians in this room is that we are here today to listen to and to honor the two judges who are the force behind the Moakley Courthouse. One could go on about their biographies, but you've already got the program brochure, so I don't think that's necessary. But what is important is that we focus together on what these two gentlemen have achieved in brick and in mortar and in social capital and in sensibility for the city. Courthouses are just like manners. Some are designed to put you at your ease. Others are designed to put you in your place. Many of you are familiar with the classical federal courthouse. It is classical, marmoreal, designed to overawe, designed to humble. It was the singular contribution of Justice Breyer and Judge Woodlock that they would take from one context, judicial restraint, which is a maxim of judicial statecraft, and apply it in another, an architectural context. The Moakley Courthouse is not replete, not in the least, with classical gestures. It doesn't exist to make you think of judges cavorting on Olympus or Parnassus. On the contrary, it is democratic in the extreme, democratic at the core of its being. The great views, the great spaces are not in chambers. They are not where judges and clerks reside. And they are not in the courtrooms where the judges preside. They are in the public spaces where the public congregates. The great views are there, and the corridors open out onto the sea, and there are brightly blazing Ellsworth Kelly panels to make the setting even more accessible and more human. Quite apart from being democratic in the way the space is allocated and organized, the building is rooted in Boston. The brick at the front of that building is the brick of cold roast Boston. There is no ornamentation, no foolish gesture, not a gratuitous anything. And the backyard is the sea by which the people who established the Massachusetts Bay Colony arrived. I am sure that everybody, especially on that panel, have their own candidate for what is the greatest courthouse in the country. But if I may say, I don't think that there is any courthouse so worthy of praise, so worthy of celebration on democratic and contextual grounds as the courthouse here on Fan Pier. So let me do two last things. First is to thank Justice Breyer and Judge Woodlock for being here today and for what they have given to the city. And second, to introduce to you our very distinguished moderator, Andrea Lears, who is a partner in one of the most highly regarded architectural firms in the city, who has a very distinguished resume and indeed an international resume. And so I thank you for agreeing to chair this panel, and the floor, Andrea, is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening. Thanks all of you for joining the Common Ground discussion, the series of conversations that are going on here weekly. I'm here tonight with two extraordinary individuals who I have been privileged to know, and in the case of Judge Woodlock, work with for many years. The nation and the citizens of Boston know Justice Breyer and Judge Woodlock for their outstanding judicial contributions. But here in Boston, we also know Justice Breyer and Judge Woodlock as the visionary and tenacious user clients behind the design of the Boston Federal Courthouse, now called the Moakley Courthouse. And in addition to all of that, public advocates, eloquent public advocates for excellence in the design of the public realm. So tonight, what we're going to do is have a kind of informal conversation. I'll ask a couple of questions. You all may want to join that conversation as well. And our two judges are going to answer eloquently, as I know they will. So my first question is, how do two judges who have a lot to do in their day jobs become interested in civic architecture and in the design of the courthouse? And what life experiences shaped their thinking? Maybe we'll start with you, Justice Breyer. And I should say that Judge Woodlock has become so adept at doing slideshows. He learned in the course of all these years working with architects that he's going to run that show.
Well, the moral of the story is simple. Let's start with the moral of the story. We didn't design this building. The person who designed this building was an architect. That was Harry Cobb. I think it's a pretty good building. And what we had to do with it is that we helped choose Harry Cobb, and we spent time and effort. All right, why spend the time and effort? That's the question. The moral of the story, if any one of you are prepared to spend time and effort at something, it probably will be better than it otherwise would be. So why spend time and effort at this? It took us a lot of time. It took us probably a day a week for about 3 years dealing with the government on the GSA. Have you ever tried to deal with GSA? Yeah, right. Exactly. Why? And Doug explained this to me. He said, I'm tempted to do it because I think it matters to people in Boston. I think it matters to you and to your children and our grandchildren and our cousins and everybody else who lives here what kind of a building you have. And if you don't think so, try Washington for a while. It now looks like there's green hitching posts everywhere. There's supposed to be some security thing. It looks to me like a refugee from a John Wayne movie shot in Mars. I mean, that's what it looks like. That's terrible. And you don't have to have that. And you can have security. And the question is, will somebody spend the time? And he said, it is worth the time, both because it'll show people that government belongs to them, and government can do something for them, and that's them doing something for themselves. You see the circle there. And he also said, by the way, because there's always some ego in everything, he said, by the way, in fact, people in 10 or 15 or 20 years will never remember a single opinion you ever write. Which is it's true. He said, but they will see this building. And it will make a difference to them. And so that's something from our own personal point of view, or our ego, but also from the community's point of view and from the government's point of view, that it is worth putting the time and effort. What qualifications did I have? I'm a human being. That's the qualifications I have. We hope so. I'm a judge. I know there's some people who doubt whether judges are human beings. But nonetheless, okay. So there we are.
Had you ever thought about architecture growing up or noticed it? Had you been observant at all? Anything in your life's experience growing up in San Francisco? Pretty good city.
It was. It's a very beautiful city. I mean, I can absolutely remember when I was 4 years old, my father taking me to Golden Gate Park and riding on the merry-go-round. That's why I thought I would not write my biography, because I thought people wouldn't be too interested in that. But it is a beautiful city. It is a lot like Boston in many ways, but I don't think I had any particular qualification. And Doug is really the one who...
How about you, Judge Woodlock?
Well, Judge Breyer is characteristically modest about this. I mean, I'll talk for him and then I'll talk for me. The reason I have the slide of the San Francisco City Hall up there, one of the great Beaux-Arts buildings, is that Justice Breyer's father practiced law there. It was a building where they had courts and they have the city government. It's also the building that there was a horrible murder in, assassination. But it was a place of civic convergence. And I think Justice Breyer grew up in that sense, the sense that the government's supposed to work, it's supposed to serve the public, it's supposed to be accessible, it's supposed to be transparent. And he brought that to our undertaking. I mean, the reason we got chosen to do it, we didn't get chosen, we chose ourselves, was we were the two youngest judges at that time on our respective courts. And none of our colleagues believed that in their lifetime anything like a new courthouse would ever happen in Boston. So they said, let the kids do it. And we did. Now, I grew up steeped in courthouses. I think I can say that I'm the only federal judge who will admit that his great-grandmother died in a county jail. I hasten to add that she died there not in custody, but because she was the wife of the deputy sheriff of Ashland County. It was this building here. And I grew up in Hartford, where my grandmother was the babysitter of choice, and she used to take me to courthouses, to actually the Paul Philippe Cray, Hartford Superior Courthouse. That was her idea of entertainment, because that's what she got from growing up in small, rural Ohio. Now, the Ashland County Courthouse is like any other courthouse all around the country. You know, you think back on Faulkner talking about the courthouses in Yakima County. He referred to them as the focus, the hub of the community. They were the central place. They were the place where you went to get licenses and you engaged in civic activity. And he talked about jails even. It said, you know, there was a time in this country when even jails were crafted with care and grace. And so, leading back to Faulkner again, I looked for the quote, but I worked as a newspaper reporter before I became a lawyer, covering courts in Chicago and Washington, D.C. And I resonated with Faulkner, who once referred to the unmistakable odor of courtrooms, that musty odor of spent lusts and greeds and bickerings and prejudice. It's a place that I've found congenial to do business and observe. And my grandmother found it congenial, and my great-grandmother, before her untimely death, did too. But it was a place of very great importance to the community, and it was something that came upon us as liberal arts majors who'd gone bad, gone to trade school, an opportunity to do something with the fine arts. I think that was part of the process, for me anyway.
Let me turn a little bit to the task that you both tackled. You were both deeply involved in the selection of the architect for the Boston Courthouse. At a time, by the way, long before the GSA had developed its Design Excellence program, really prodded that into existence probably. So you went out, you got some advisors, and Bill Lacey and others, you looked at a lot of work. What were you looking for, and what were you not looking for?
You're looking for.
What were you looking for, Justice Breyer?
You know, when we went around, well, the first thing we did was Vinnie Flanagan, our circuit executive. I was chief judge of the circuit, which is the appeals court, and our circuit exec was Vinnie Flanagan. And so the whole idea was to first make ourselves, and this is easier to do, but it's important if you're building a public building, easier to do now, make ourselves credible to the architectural community. By that I mean that a lot of people don't like building government buildings who are architects, because it's a real pain. There are all kinds of things you have to go through, which no one would want to go through. So we want to make ourselves credible in the sense that good architects will bid on this building and participate. To do that, Vinnie found in our budget somewhere $50,000, and we hired as a consultant Bill Lacey, who was secretary of the Pritzker Prize Committee. And we got Vinnie. See, the GSA doesn't know exactly what authority or power a judge has. So if we'd say we'd like to do something, they thought maybe they had to say yes. So we smuggled Vinnie onto the committee. And he got almost all of the good architects, almost all, one didn't, but got them through that first thing. And then we had them down to, I think, 7. Mm-hmm. All right, then we said to GSA, we always kept them involved. We said, now we're going to go look at their buildings. Would you like to come? No, we didn't want to come. They have other things to do. Okay. So Vinnie, Lacey, Doug, and I got in Vinnie's old car, and we drove down to Princeton, and we went to New York, and we looked at Caesar Pelli's building in Venturi, and we went up to Ottawa, and we looked at Moshe Safdie, and we saw Harry Cobb's buildings in Philadelphia. And we looked at some around here, and Childs we saw in New York, and we talked to people who were tenants and said, "How do you like the building? What's the best thing about it? What's the worst thing about it? What would you change if you could?" You know, perfectly obvious questions. And so what we're looking for would be somebody who would be able to build a decent building an attractive and useful building, and the theme was going to be to try to make certain that the community didn't see it as something separate. It would be a building that that other people who weren't judges and weren't lawyers could use, and it wouldn't be too forbidding. And that was a perfectly simple idea, a perfectly clear idea. And so but what it involved was just that, right?
I think, the choice of Harry Cobb was in part that he was a teacher. He had been the dean of or chair of the architecture department at the GSD. And we were embarking on a learning experience. In part, we chose the finalists because there were people who'd never done a courthouse before. We wanted to have a fresh conversation with someone who was going to ask us questions like, why do you do that? And then have us in the awkward position, for judges anyway, of having to justify. Why do we do that? Mm-hmm. And so we had a dialogue with Harry for probably 2 years. In keeping with our theme of keeping GSA involved, we always scheduled the meetings on Saturdays, always invited them, and they never came.
I mean, I know we're being awfully mean to GSA, but in a way it's gotten a lot better. I really think it has. I mean, because they've got interested in architecture. And it wasn't that people, I mean, they're perfectly good public servants, and they'll try and do the job that they're asked to do. And so it isn't a hostile relation necessarily. But Harry was chosen. Probably there were very good architects that came into that panel. It was very hard to choose among them. But what Harry did actually, which doesn't necessarily mean he was a better architect than the others, but he spoke to our problem. He showed us, that building. He started by showing us that building, which is a courthouse in Virginia. And he said, now look at that 17th century courthouse, 18th century courthouse. Okay. Now, it has that front there, which is a place where the community would gather in the evenings on that porch. It has a kind of steeple or raised area roof, which suggested at that time that it served a public function. And inside, there's a single courtroom. And that courtroom is where the judge, who's a public servant, does his business. That's where people come in. It's simple. It's clear. It serves a public function. It helps the community. He said, that isn't so hard to design, and it's very attractive. He said, now look at the 19th century. And remember the San Francisco City Hall. He said, you still can do that. Now, though, there are 4 courtrooms. Now, and that isn't true of the City Hall in San Francisco, but many of them were. But you had a dome, which was a symbol of a public building. And then underneath the dome is a public space where lawyers and others can gather. And then there are courtrooms opening off, which is where the service, the function of the building is really served. All right, the architecture can mirror in an attractive way what the function of the building is and what it is for the community. He said, now let me show you a modern courthouse. Have we got that?
We've got an example.
Yeah, he said, what's that? He says, is that a courthouse or is that a prison? He says, or is it possibly a hospital or an apartment building or a business office? It tells us nothing. Now, why did they design it that way? Because there's so many courtrooms. There's so much going on that it's very hard to design a building like that Virginia courthouse when you have 20 courtrooms. So he said the challenge is to try to take a building that will have 18, 19, 20 courtrooms and to bring back the idea that was there in that Virginia courthouse and in the Beaux-Arts courthouse of the 19th century. And he said, that's what I would try to do. No guarantees. And he sat there, and I learned from that, don't have a design competition. Have a competition for an architect. I mean, architects are quite good at producing design, but they'll produce the design before they really understand what goes on in that building. I heard, what's his name, the City Hall, the Disney Center?
Frank Gehry?
Yeah, Frank Gehry was being interviewed. And Gwen Eiffel was asking him a question, and she said, well, suppose you had a client, a business client, and what's the first question you'd ask him? And she thought he was going to say something about form, or did he like curves or something, I don't know. Well, he said the first thing I'd ask him is, what kind of business do you have? You see? So then he'll know what kind of building. And then he said he sat for about a year with the Los Angeles Symphony, with the orchestra, as they practiced, to see what it was that they were seeing and needed in the building. Harry did exactly that. Yeah. He spent about a year going to courtrooms and finding out what the function was. What did the public want? What did it see? What did the judge want? What did the jury need, etc.?
Yeah. There was another dimension to it, that I want to emphasize. We are talking about the program for courts. But there were good things going on in the mid-20th century in courts. This is the British Columbia Law Courts in Vancouver. And it's meant to be a public building. That's the entranceway to all of the courtrooms, that tiered ensemble, three floors, just like Boston, actually, with a big picture window. And part of our program, apart from serving judges who are there or at least active in public between 9 and 5, is to make it a public building. So to provide spaces in the building that would encourage people to come in and use it as a public building, not just as a courthouse, not just that limited function, to encourage kids to come in and learn a little bit about civic education, which frankly has been lost in this country for the last 50 years. I mean, one of the things that we were fighting against is an observation that Daniel Patrick Moynihan made, probably thinking of courthouses, let's see here, like this. Let's see if I can. Oh, I'll go back again. I apologize. But thinking about the Middlesex County Courthouse that I showed you, that Justice Breyer made mention of. Let's go to that, if I can. With apologies. You know, Moynihan said, just about this time, the time that this was created, 1970, the 20th century America has seen a steady, persistent decline in the visual and emotional power of its public buildings. And this has been accompanied by a not less persistent decline in the authority of its public order. And I think that has to do with a lack of understanding of what civic engagement is about. This is a public building, but there's a distinction to be made. It's a civic building. We tend to think of public buildings as places for casual recreation and concerted consumption. This is a building that's supposed to be the formative space for American democracy at its most precise level, deciding cases and controversies, not just judges but jurors, and making the public understand it. And so we had, this idea that we wanted to have the public come in in an area that was, capable of being viewed from the outside and having a feeling from the inside. Now, you have public buildings like the ones that Justice Breyer was talking about. There's the old St. Louis Courthouse. That's the beginning of the multiplication of courtrooms, which are the ultimate destinations, and it creates particular problems, but it creates another problem. That's probably your idea of an courthouse. But let me introduce another idea. That's the court where the Dred Scott case was tried. That's the case in which a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court held in an opinion that a black man has no rights that a white man is required to observe. And so in a heterogeneous society like we have now, and we emphasize, stylistic aspects like classicism have resonances that maybe middle-aged white men don't quite understand in quite the same way. And that provided another challenge and demand to make this a public building that was fully resonant with and inviting to everyone in the community. Now, I don't mean to make Justice Breyer talk about his last vacation, but let me show you this building, and Justice Breyer can talk about it. It's the Constitutional Court in South Africa. And I think you were just there last week.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. I mean, they built that Constitutional Court on Constitution Hill, and you go in up a little path which looks like an African village path. They got that idea. But on your right is the worst prison, where they put all the ANC people and all the people who were against apartheid. And on the left is the courthouse. So they've used that prison as a kind of base. And then when you go in at the top, the courtroom is excellent because, from an appellate judge's point of view, the public gets in there very easily. There's a bench in the front, but the lawyer is at the same level. See, and if you haven't done this, I know, but I mean, if in my job, as an appeals court judge or now a Supreme Court justice, but what you're trying to do, which the lawyers, of course, want to resist, is you're trying actually, hard to believe, but you're trying to find out an answer to a question that's difficult. And you're trying to get a better rather than worse conclusion out of this. And the lawyers are there to help you. Now, they think they're there to win their case. And that's a difference of point of view. But if you can engage the lawyer in a conversation, then they'll answer. And sometimes a lot that's productive grows out of that conversation. I saw the courtroom that Learned Hand built in New York, the Court of Appeals, and it does that. It's like a sitting room. And the lawyer is there at the same eye level. We both saw that. And so you can get a conversation going because they get interested and forget the other people who were there, and that's what they've done in that South African courtroom. Absolutely eye to eye. Same eye level. The audience is in back. The bench is curved, and the different judges can engage the lawyer in conversation. And then you look out the window. The window, they have natural light coming in, which is good. And you see people coming by at a sort of leg level, really. and it's sort of, they have some theory of that. But it brings in the light and the theory as well. It's everybody in the world going by this, and it all belongs to them. It's part of the community, which is true. And then they have local art people who do paintings and sculptures and things on the outside of the courtroom, but the inside of the building. And that's true of our courthouse there in Boston, too. The local artists can exhibit. So it's very good, I think, and it's a good court, and they've been successful.
But one thing to remember about that court is look on the right-hand side. That's the jail. They kept the jail. I mean, they're not using the jail now quite the same way, but they kept it. And that, in some ways, is what architecture is about, and particularly architecture with this ambiguous history that the courts have in South Africa and in the United States. And so part of what we wanted to do is, like all architects, we wanted to have a marriage of memory and invention. That's the South African Constitutional Court. So how did we do it? Well, one of the things that we wanted to do was to create a meaningful passageway, a processional from what is the disordered street, where people are jouncing into each other, into the highly ordered, almost like kabuki dance quality of the courtroom itself. And to make that passage one that reflected a variety of different styles. That style was less important to us than the function of bringing people in a meaningful sort of way to understand that this was a public building. So let me walk you through that a little bit. That's the stairway to the Allegheny County Courthouse. It was done by the fellow who did the Trinity Church just down the street, H.H. Richardson. Useful play of arches and spaces and turning, and there's ours. Different style, of course, but the same kind of idea, bringing people in to the aha moment that's on the second floor. They brings them through public art. This is Ellsworth Kelly's set of what are called the Boston panels. Boston has since, and relatively recently, realized how important Ellsworth Kelly is. Boston, for many, many years, avoided modern art. And Kelly, who started at the museum school, welcomed this opportunity to enliven that space. That's the drum that is in the central rotunda of the courthouse. So it brings you up to the second floor. And the idea is to have a meeting place that's a little bit like the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand in London. A central space that people could come through and meet in. The public could come to and meet in, as they do now in the Royal Courts. So we have, let's see, something like that on the second floor with the very best view of Boston, I think. And it's a public view. You can look out at the city. People in the city can look back at you. We look out not just at rich people's housing over in Rose Wharf, but at Everett, in East Boston, and the harbor itself, where we take many of our cases. For the first 100 years, we were known as the Admiralty Court case. But on that second floor where those people are standing, we can have, and have had, dinners for 600, 800 people. We have about 100 events every year in that space. Not legal events. These are events of community convergence. We move people down the hall. This is the Israeli Supreme Court, just absolutely marvelous building, where they pierced a wall of Jerusalem stone with entryways that are very much like entryways into the city. The idea is you've got a multiplicity of courtrooms, but you've got like a street of courtrooms, so people feel that they're in a public area. And we tried to duplicate that with the kind of elliptical half vault that you see through the courtroom floors. We have 3 courtroom floors, just like Vancouver, 27 courtrooms. And then that brings you to the heart of the building. That's the entranceway to all of the courtrooms. That just happens to be mine. But every one of the courtrooms has an entryway like that, an elliptical half vault, crafted by brickworkers, masons, in ways that they haven't done for 100 years. And that's part of it. Not just transparency, but attention to craft. We use something called water-struck brick. They don't make brick that way anymore. Now they make brick as a kind of extruded like toothpaste and cut off with wire cutters. But Harry very much wanted to have water-struck brick, which is made in individual molds, and it's fired and then it's cooled down. And it creates individual bricks. A little bit like the cases and controversies that we deal with. That we try to tailor it to a particular case. And then brick by brick by brick, laid up, you create the structure of the common law. Not a particularly striking kind of parallel, but a functional one that means a lot to us. That there's craft involved in what we do, and it ought to be reflected in the building itself. And then that brings you to the destination of the building. And Justice Breyer had very strong views about it. He talked about it a bit. But you look at that bench there, and if you're standing as a lawyer, you're standing eye to eye with the judge who's sitting. And that's the conversation that we mean to have. But there's a larger issue, I think, that Justice Breyer's spoken to about what differentiates a court from another governmental agency.
And I would just ask as well, because as a designer, one of our hardest tasks is to think about how to represent justice in built form. This is a very elusive but fundamental goal. It is a question we ask ourselves. It's a question that comes down to the design of the courtroom. What goes on in the courtroom? How do we represent it? We know that the symbols that have preceded us really need to be reinterpreted. So what is important to symbolize justice in the courtroom and in the building itself? Perhaps, Justice Breyer, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I was thinking in the South African, they have the South African courthouse. There you see a lot of tree symbolism, and that's because they're trying to go back in that society to the notion of the judge being somebody sitting under a tree and dispensing justice. And that's true there. That's one of the roots, but that won't speak to our society. We have an interest in this. I mean, as judges, a judge is not a bureaucrat. And a judge doesn't dispense justice. There's a right to justice. You work towards justice. You don't dispense it.
And that's you say the judge is a piece of furniture.
Yeah, well, it's not. It's that in the judiciary, the obligation of the judge is to devote, and he's a fairly high-level official, but you, if you're there or represented there, you have a fairly high-level official coming face to face with the individual citizen, whether he's rich, poor, powerful, or the least popular person in the United States, and devoting equally, and depending on need of the person, not the need of the judge, the time, the personal time, face to face with that individual. And that's what we want to show with this architecture. And because from an institutional point of view, it's important that people who aren't lawyers and aren't judges, and I say this a lot, but it's true, contrary to popular belief, 308 million of our citizens are neither judges nor lawyers. And they have to understand that this institution works, not perfectly, but works for them, so that it is a place where popularity doesn't matter, where influence doesn't matter, where the point is equal time and effort to you, whoever you are, depending on the need of the case of your problem. Face to face, not through some bureaucracy. And maybe we can tell that story a little bit in architecture. Maybe. And if, in fact, you look around today, see, Harry asked us this. He showed us a picture. He said, this is the courthouse in Brussels. And the courthouse in Brussels is a processional. And the processional, a little bit like the Supreme Court, I have to say. There is a slight feeling in the Supreme Court, grand as a building as it is, that one of the justices, Vanderwarker or somebody, said it was like nine Beatles in the Temple of Karnak. Well, there's something to that. But there's a procession up towards the judge in Brussels, but that's wrong. A judge is not a king. He is, in a sense, and that's why that English building is so much better. It's secular Gothic. And the secular Gothic is like a marketplace. And what's going on in that marketplace is the public's business. And the people who are conducting that business are the lawyers and their clients, walking back and forth across that marketplace and talking. And the judges are in these rooms on the side. I said like the furniture, but that overstates it. They're not like furniture, but they are part of the mechanism designed not to dispense justice, but to work towards that end in cooperation with the lawyers, the others. And you'll see that idea, bringing the public in. It's the public's building, not the judiciary's. Bringing the public in, serving multiple uses, not a processional, calling upon the notion, which is an ancient notion, justice, justice shall you pursue. You see, you pursue justice. You don't dispense it. And all of that, you see, we hope, we think, that Harry's idea was that in Boston, in Johannesburg, in Melbourne, in Jerusalem, in the Rogers Building, Richard Rogers Building in Bordeaux. And there was no discussion among those people who produced those buildings. But there's an uncanny resemblance in their basic objectives and their basic architecture, different though it is in individual appearances. I think something's responding today to a democratic need for a society where there is an independent judiciary, which is not democratic, but designed to secure justice to the citizens, guarantee, protect their rights, protect the democracy of that democracy.
The democratic aspect of this is formally expressed in that courtroom that Harry designed. Look at those arches. The vantage point that you're looking at is from the spectator section. The spectator would have come through a door that is under an arch just like that. And at the other side, at the other end of the room, is an arch that the judge's bench is under. And on the left-hand side is where the witness box is, and the right-hand side is where the jurors are. The traditional formula for a courtroom, except the arches. The arches are equal in size. The arch that the jurors are under, the arch that the witness is under, the arch that the spectators come through, and the arch that the judge is under are the same size. They've got different job descriptions. The witness there is to tell the truth. The jury is there to figure out whether the truth has been told, and the spectators are there to watch to make sure that things are on the up and up. And the judge, I suppose, is there to provide adult supervision. And in the center, you have you can see the circular stencil. The completion of the arches. That's where the business is done, in the well of the court with the lawyers and the witnesses and so on. And so those arches are partial. They're not complete circles. We have to work together to make justice, to pursue justice. And it's a democratic undertaking. We in New England understand, New England town meeting. That's the last direct democracy. But apart from that, it's a jury, where individual citizens are brought in to decide factual matters of great moment to the general public and to the government itself. And so in various ways, in Johannesburg, in Israel, in Melbourne, and in Boston, the architects have sought to present what it is that we aspire to in justice in formal ways. And this was our contribution. There have been numerous other contributions by architects who are here today, like Andrea or Bill Ron, working with their communities to try to, and the community of users, to try to realize in a formal sense what it is that we all yearn for, which is a fair shake by people who are disinterested and going to play fair. And the space itself ought to represent that. That's at least what we were trying to do.
I just have to add here, I think you're beginning to get a sense of how incredibly thoughtful and reflective these two individuals are in the making of their courthouse, in thinking about what it is for in a way that makes their architects able to try to translate that. I'm recalling at the same time that the Boston Courthouse was being designed, I was working on the Worcester Federal Courthouse with Judge Woodlock, who was acting as in loco judge for that courthouse. Well, we were all, Harry Cobb and I, and Judge Woodlock and several others, on what we called the Magical Mystery Tour. We went to look at their favorite courthouses together. Harry and I took them to our favorite places. We went to the library at Exeter by Louis Kahn, for example. We looked together. And then there were the weekly missals that came, the readings that arrived every single week for nearly a year from Judge Woodlock, so that we would, and I know Harry got them too, so that we would all be sufficiently educated in the purpose of these courthouses. What I really mean to say is there was a great deal of serious and profound thinking that went on between designers and judges in order to produce these courthouses. It's an extraordinary undertaking. I think we're nearing the time where we should ask for questions from the audience, but maybe one more word or so about how you believe the Moakley Courthouse realized your hopes and aspirations. I think you have one more image.
Well, it's the...
Yeah.
And that's the building. You can see what's going on with the major move that Harry made. It's a brick building. It looks like a warehouse, really, although it's now starting to take on a real, understandable, legible mission in the area, kind of anchoring that area of Boston. But he cracked it open like an egg. And he provided the opportunity for you to look in and see what's going on in the courthouse. You can see every one of those 27 courtrooms. They're yours. And the people coming out of the courtroom itself can see across the water the various places that disputes come from in the city. A day doesn't go by, well, I shouldn't say day, a month doesn't go by that I don't hear from a juror who tells me that they'll be standing over in Rose Wharf and they can see the courtroom that they were in and that they produced justice. It is an effort, as best we can, to engage the public in ways of understanding what it is that we all aspire to. And one thing that we haven't talked about, and Justice Breyer talks about it very eloquently in other contexts, is we aren't just the public. I mean, we went to maybe 100 public meetings of various kinds. Judges aren't used to that. Judges, you're supposed to come to the judge, not the judge go. But it was incredibly important, just as important as questions will be here, for us to hear from the public about how they related to the building. I always say the most important space in that building is a wall, and it's a wall filled with names. And it's the name of every person who worked on that building. Laborers, bricklayers, a couple judges, all in alphabetical order. It's about 1,000 names. One of the bricklayers came up to me and said, you know, I've been spending all my life trying to keep my name off the wall of the courthouse. But two things. Number one, the bricklayers in their apprenticeship program bring them to the courthouse at the end and say, when you get to be a master, this is something you can do, an elliptical half wall. And they come twice a year. The other is I see people coming down to that wall, elderly men and women, more elderly now, who point to their name and say, I was part of this. I made part of this building. It's part of the larger community. And that's, I think, what we were aspiring to, and that it is successful. Now, is it the knock your socks off kind of architecture? No. There's, in a previous, long ago, maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago, Simon Rifkin, who was a federal judge and then practiced law, was asked the principal ethics question about how should judges relate to the community. And he was speaking about a demographic that's different now. It's mostly all men. And he said, a judge's wife should not be the first woman in the community to wear a topless bathing suit. Similarly, it can be said about courthouses. They can't be at quite the cutting edge, I think, and still maintain the larger consent. Nevertheless, they should be sturdy and durable and look like what they're supposed to produce and look like it for a very long time. And that's what I think we've succeeded in this building.
How about you, Justice Breyer?
Did
it realize your aspirations?
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, I think it does. I like very much the fact a lot of the people in the legal community bring in school children a lot, and they have moot courts there, and I like it very much that it's used in the evenings by people who are not lawyers and judges. And Doug went around and found a lot of rather good statements of different people that are chiseled up there, you know, and the jurors, while they're sitting there, say, what's that? And they have to sit in a rather nice jury room, actually. And we have a rather good cafeteria, and it's not that expensive, and the food is actually pretty good. And Harry is such a perfectionist, you know, he designed all the chairs and the tables, and it's really pretty attractive. But you have to make up your own mind, so go there. Now, when you go there and look at it, if you like it, and I think probably you will, say, okay, there's a larger lesson here. There's a special pleading for the judiciary. When I see the school children coming in and learning about judges, that pleases me as a judge, because they're learning about their government, and they understand some of it, and it's important. That's special pleading for the judiciary. But there is a broader point, because if you think that works, then you see, it does help to take an interest in architecture. And it isn't just judges. It's every public building and every business building and every building in the United States. And that's where people can make a difference. And the reason I'm making that obvious point is because if you just leave it alone, you're not going to get a good result. And if you want some proof of that, go down and look at Washington, D.C. And the difference, what can be built. So what I say, what about our State Department? I mean, I'm terribly, it's some beautiful State Department buildings and embassies, and you look at some going up, they're now looking like Fort Knox because the security people have taken over. Well, there is a security problem. But if you get somebody in authority to sit the security person down with the architect, you can get some result that isn't too bad. And it doesn't have to look like Fort Knox. But all of that, you say to people, look, every human being in the world, from the time he's 4 months old, notices that he's surrounded by color. And he's surrounded by sound. And he's surrounded by shapes. And those colors and shapes and sounds can be nicer or less nice. They can look terrible. They can sound like a garbage can. Or they can sound like Louis Armstrong. And the same is true of buildings and the environment we're in every day. And of course it makes a difference to people. And of course it makes a difference to the community. And of course it makes a difference to be certain that we do have those environments that bring out the best in us and raise our spirits rather than letting them sink. If communities get involved with those who will build these public buildings and say, we understand there's a security problem, but that isn't the whole story. That's the broader point, if you like the building. And I hope you will go there, and I hope you will see it, and of course I hope you like it, but that's up to you.
Well, it's been great to hear both of you reflect and muse about this experience. I think we're looking at two individuals here who are first fundamentally curious people. They wanted to learn more about what it took to make their courthouse. They are caring citizens wanting the best for this city and for the work that they do. This is really, really exceptional. And I think the results are there to see. But there are hardly two other people, I think, who care more deeply about quality in public life, the value of a beautiful and effective and useful and significant common ground. So I want to thank both of you for the 10 years of work that you did to make the courthouse happen. We may have time for one or two questions from the audience. Do we have one up here? Yeah. Do we have someone who can bring a microphone down here? Is there someone who can bring? Yeah. Okay, I will.
Judge Woodlock and Justice Breyer, thank you for taking the time to meet with us. Did you have a budget and did you come in under budget?
Yep.
Did they have a budget and did they come in under budget?
Yep, on time, within budget.
How much was it?
$220 million. $165 million construction.
About $200 a square foot for the construction.
Yeah, well, that was the average. It didn't cost more. It didn't cost less than the average. And on time, we told Harry, it was pay Cobb free. And we said, you tell us what you really need. We'll get it. Well, I mean, I have to admit, we used a lot of underhanded stuff. Because we did get, because there was $50 million put in. I used to work in the Senate for Senator Kennedy before I became a judge, and so some of my friends were still there, and I shouldn't admit this, but we did, in fact, the Senate put in $185 million, but they intended to recede to the House, where Congressman Moakley had put in $55 million. What they didn't know was that Congressman Early from Worcester would get Congressman Moakley to go to the meeting where they reconciled the budgets. And when the Senate said the Senate recedes to the House, which was $55 million, the House said, namely Congressman Moakley, who was quite a figure, oh, no, it doesn't. He said the House recedes to the Senate. So there we had 185, but we needed 220. And so as it turned out, we said, well, to the U.S. Attorney, it is a great pity, but there isn't room for you. and the Justice Department decided there was a national security problem. And there, we did then get the $220 million, which we needed. And that was, and when it went up, it was $210 a square foot, which was the average amount. And it came in, as I say, within budget and on time. I mean, he was over there just like almost every day, urging those bricklayers on, and it did happen.
In the middle here, yes.
Thank you both for producing a building. It's so much a part of the fabric of the city. It's terrific. So I want to change the context. The rest of the buildings that are going up now in the Seaport District are less like Boston than yours. And as you look out at the scale, the vast scale of everything that's being built at the Seaport, can you give us your thoughts about how it might shape up in the future?
Here's hoping. One of the things that was surprising to us is that it didn't build up more quickly. We brought the infrastructure in there effectively. Part of our process was to bring the Silver Line into the area, or justify the Silver Line. What's growing up around it is, corporate America. And that's a little disheartening. As architecture, it's corporate architecture. It's not quite the kind of corporate architecture that will last as long as its mortgage. But one has a sense of impermanence to it, of a facade. But what's important is it's corporate architecture that's being done with attention to the lower register, the first floor, the second floor, the third floor, the fourth floor, where there's going to be retail operations that will make a livelier street face. And it will be, Bill Ron makes this argument, I think, very effectively, two-sided streets, not just one side. Right now, or not right now, but, actually right now, we're the sound of one hand clapping. There's nobody on the other side of the street. You don't have that sense of movement. We're almost there. And so I can accept anything that brings a lively public sphere to that area, and that's what is happening there. I wish that there were greater architecture, and that's another story about the enervation of development in where money is spent on lots of things, but it's taken from the architecture of the building.
Yeah, I'll add one thing, because maybe you can get involved in this. I mean, so far nothing's been built on the main street opposite the courthouse. So as you look at it, it looks as if the courthouse is cutting you off from the sea. But that is not what it's going to look like, because the idea of the design there was that a building would be built opposite. And so there'd be a kind of canyon that you'd walk down. Now, as you do that, you see the arches with some kind of granite and statements and so forth, and trees, which are attractive. But for that to work, it matters what's built on the other side. You have to have something in that parking lot that is in harmony at street level with the facade of the courthouse. Now, I can tell you what doesn't work, in my opinion, is the other perpendicular street is being built up on the other side. They are building a building there. They put it up. And I was just walking down there yesterday, and I think it's awful. I mean, it destroys. You don't have a feel. Of course, not many people will walk down that street. It wasn't for that purpose. It's mostly for small cars and deliveries into the courthouse. But still, there's no attention paid by the new building to a harmony with the facade of the courthouse. Now, if that happens for the long street, I think it's really unfortunate. And the only way it won't happen is if there are citizens groups that pay attention to this and say, okay, a judge doesn't have the power to stop it. A judge, Lee Campbell told me this years ago. He said, a judge is a person who has a lot of authority in a very narrow area. And while the judge, if she or she is speaking in that area, the lawyers and others will pay attention. But you get out of that area, and the lawyers will pretend to pay attention, because they might have a case in front of you. But they get out of there and say, there he goes again, there she goes again, I mean, so we can't, there's nothing much we can do but others can. So I think you've raised a very good point. It matters a lot what that parking lot turns into. And there should be harmony there, and I hope people will help with that.
It's the old story, variant on the old story of if there's one lawyer in town, he starves. When if there are two of them, they flourish. And that happens with buildings too, when they start talking to each other and engaging with each other.
Actually, in fact, the best thing that has happened here is the courthouse was built first. Remember, it set a tremendously high standard, yet to be matched, I think. But for the longest time, when the site was chosen, you probably all remember, many of you remember, what a debate it was. It was thought to be a terrible choice, not the highest and best use for that site, to put a public building. And there was a great deal of pressure to make a good public waterfront area, which is in fact wonderful and widely used. So I think that the courthouse has actually added a great deal and been a tremendous inspiration for that area, building something that will stand as a terrific example of how well you can build in that zone. But it's yet to come. There's a lot of work there. There's actually several proposals already in the works across the street, and that area will see a lot of building. We've run kind of late. Maybe one more question, and then we should finish. Tell me.
There's a fellow up there.
One more up here.
Thank you. I have a question about I think an allusion was made to it in the last question and answer. The quotations that are on the courthouse and when you enter the main entranceway, I think it's the Mendes. And it's been enlightening to me to hear that the care of the entire building reflects the care that went into selecting these quotes. I'd like to ask how they came about and how they were selected.
The question is how the quotes on the building, throughout the building, came about.
It was a nationwide search. My clerks and I did it. My concern was if I did it by a committee of judges, there wouldn't be any quotes up there. But those quotes are meaningful in a variety of different ways. They're meant to engage people. They are from Massachusetts people or people with associations with Massachusetts who talk about the law. If you go down Old Northern Avenue, it's really a timeline. It starts with William Cushing, the first Justice of the Supreme Court from Massachusetts, when he was a Supreme Judicial Court Chief Justice, striking down slavery in Massachusetts more than 7 years before the Civil War. You move down to the end, and the last quote on the wall is Jack Kennedy's speech introducing what became the Civil Rights Act of 1964, saying we are faced primarily with a moral question, whether we will treat our fellow human beings as we want to be treated. And it's meant to engage people. But the one that, well, there are two. I'll tell you one on Northern Avenue, and then I'll tell you another. The one on Northern Avenue that is most important to me, and on a monthly, maybe a weekly basis, I see this, is one by Frederick Douglass. Douglass talks about how if any section of the community feels compromised, then neither person nor property will be safe. And a week does not pass, truly, a week does not pass that I don't see a black family with little kids walking down the street and stopping and see the mom or the dad pointing to that and talking to their kids. They're part of the conversation. Here was someone who is important to the conversation, and this is what this building is about. That's one quote. The other quote was a violation of the rule that I made. The rule I made was no live judges, because my colleagues would come to me and say, I have a very interesting case about the removal jurisdiction of the federal court. and I thought I'd cut that off at the pass, except that Harry and I conspired. We have one live judge. It's Justice Breyer. When we started this process, we had a symposium at the Harvard Law School. And the very first speaker was Justice Breyer. outlining what it was that then Chief Judge Breyer, outlining what it was that we wanted to do. And the quote was this: "This most public space in Boston doesn't belong to the judges, it doesn't belong to the lawyers, it doesn't belong to the litigants, it belongs to the public." And so right at the curbstone, right outside that entryway that you see there, that's carved. This building is very talkative, didactic, I suppose, but then so are judges. But it's meant to engage people in the conversation in a variety of different ways, and that's one of the ways.
I think we're going to conclude this evening and thank Justice Breyer, Judge Woodlock, for sharing all that they've done here. Thank you so much.